Yes, indeed, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the program. I'm, of course, your host, long-suffering Shanghai Pete, and, oh my god. I can't even begin to tell you how glad I am to be done with this. I've been positively haunted by this goddamn game. Costa del Sol alone almost stopped me in my tracks. It almost brought this entire Herculean effort down. I almost couldn't do it. The minigames, guys. The minigames, I'm gonna be having trauma nightmares from them for weeks. They were unconscionable, but I am getting ahead of myself, as you can tell. It's time, finally, at long last, to talk about part 2 of the infamous Final Fantasy VII Remake, titled Rebirth. The audience for this game, reluctant or otherwise, essentially, we can divide them into two camps. Those who were in favor of a remake being done as a bloated 3-part catastrophe that wildly perverted the original pacing, story, and characters of a beloved classic game, and those who thought that maybe sounded like a bad idea. Now, if you're one of the people who thought it sounded great from the beginning, had no problem with Square's approach to the remake, nothing I can say is going to change your mind. In fact, I'm not going to try. You've likely already bought this game, played through it, love it, and think I'm retarded because I don't agree. And you know what? That's fine. Honestly, I'm happy for everyone that has something to play that they're enjoying. That's cool. I'm glad you guys are having fun. Don't let my dumbass bum you out. Besides, my ire is reserved for abusive, exploitative corpos, not their victims. You guys can go ahead and downvote the video, maybe leave a mean comment that'll hurt my feelings or whatever it is y'all do. The rest of us are going to apply some critical analysis and get deep inside Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 Rebirth. But wait, before we get started though, in light of the tone of this video, it's gonna be kind of rough. I think now is a good time to introduce a brand new segment to the show, which I'm going to call Sometimes There's Good Stuff. Today's good stuff is an early access game I found recently called Witchfire. I'd actually read about this game like years ago when it was first announced, but never saw any follow-up about it until recently. Done by the Astronauts, formerly People Can Fly, the devs behind the excellent shooters Painkiller and Bulletstorm, Witchfire, even though it's still very, very early access, guys, it's a certified banger already, I promise. It's basically a cross between a Souls-like and a roguelite, but as an ultra-gothic FPS, and holy shit. I've been playing an absolute ton of this. Its new update, Ghost Galleon, just dropped, adds a ton of new stuff. If you're into Souls-like games, FPSs, even just gothic aesthetics, shit like that, definitely check this out. I've seen almost no coverage of it, which is a real shame because it's super awesome. I only just found out about it this month, and it's been in early access since like September. Legacy Games Media is such garbage. Anyway, you can buy it for only $40, or if you're strapped for cash, there's torrents of the first early access release floating around out there. Anyway, enough fun. Time for Final Fantasy VII. Now, before we get too far into it, I'm just gonna make this known first. This is a much better game than Part 1. Like, we're talking much better. Mostly in that it's actually a game and not an introductory sequence torturously exaggerated from 3 or so hours out to an absurd 40 plus. And that's great. I never wanted to hate this remake. I'm sure none of you did either. In fact, I would have really preferred to enjoy it. I love Final Fantasy VII. Square Enix just kind of forced my hand by making it largely an intolerable mess for crazed lunatics and fans of the multiverse. So it was a pleasant surprise to find when I first started playing that Rebirth is not a completely lost cause, not at all. There are parts of it I genuinely found myself enjoying, and some, dare I say it, that are relatively well done. In fact, it only took till around chapter 10 or so before I found myself enjoying it. In light of this, it is extremely sad, bittersweet even, when reality insists on just repeatedly crashing down during your playthrough to remind you that Square's unfettered ambition and commitment to blind, rampant avarice just always lurking, ready to ruin your experience at any moment, and indeed were destined to ruin this remake, regardless of how well crafted and designed some parts of it ended up being. Never forget, there was no reason that they couldn't have just taken Final Fantasy VII and reskinned it. No reason except for the profit motive, of course, which ultimately was the only thing guiding the design decision that took it from a simple, fun HD reskin of FF7 into whatever this is. And it's that design decision at the top of this entire project that really doomed it from the start. Not doomed it commercially, of course, but exactly the opposite, doomed it for fans. Which is naturally the one and only reason they proceeded with the direction that they did, so it makes and will continue to make Square Enix a literal king's fortune. You can't tell the Corpo bosses that we're only selling one game, gonna need at least 3. Okay, no problem, we could do that, and all it costs was the sacrifice of a delicate balance and pacing, brilliant storytelling, and timeless characters of a literal masterpiece in favor of, I don't know, cloned Sephiroth zombies? Small price to pay, am I right, G's? And sadly, that's evident it's evident at every turn in Rebirth. Perhaps not quite so glaring and outright painfully as it was in part 1, but it's still obvious and bad. And what ultimately moves this from a drama and well into the tragedy territory is that there are a few brief moments where you can almost see it working. Where you almost, just for a moment, feel like you're playing Final Fantasy VII. And in those brief fleeting moments, it's really awesome. It will absolutely drive you crazy. At least it drove me crazy. In a way, Rebirth is kind of like 40 hours of blue balls, and as you're playing, you keep waiting for it to just drop the act and just be the good RPG that it seems to keep insisting that it is, but it never does. Instead, it's just constantly getting in its own way. Oh, bless your heart, guys, but what the fuck were y'all doing? The story was confusing in part 1, or maybe I should say stupid, and no less so in Rebirth. Now, if that was maybe in service to some greater plan, some more grandiose, better, more improved narrative that, they just couldn't quite pull off, fine. Not great, but fine. Understandable, honest mistake. You sincerely wanted to advance and elaborate on your story in ways that weren't possible previously, and oops, y'all just weren't up to the task. That sucks, but it happens. Sure, I get that. But that's not what happened here. I honestly wish I could talk about this game and the problems with it without constantly having to bring up how monetary forces affected it, but they're too inextricably linked. I can't not talk about it when that's why the storytelling ultimately is the way it is, and why it so disastrously butchers not only the art, but the intent of the original. It's because Square Enix's greed-mongering ways demanded that they do whatever was necessary to stretch this sumbitch out to fill at least 3 major project releases. If that means vivisecting the story and original narrative, so fucking what? Do it. If that means creating a bunch of insane plot holes and injecting story pacing elements that fail to make sense with anything else happening, so fucking what? Do it. If that means intentionally leaving the explanation of key plot elements to the very end of the game, and sometimes even then, just letting them hang there and leaving the player guessing in confusion for 90% of the experience, so fucking what? Do it. Remember, Final Fantasy VII, as an IP, was always way too fucking valuable to waste an entire remake opportunity on what would amount to a single $70 one-time purchase per customer. That isn't nearly enough return on investment for 21st century Corpos, not even close. They needed multiple parts with all kinds of interludes and integrades and bundle deals and upgrade packages and deluxe editions so that they could make the maximum amount of profit possible from the IP. It's called attach rate. How many additional purchases can we trick the customer into making past the first one? It's not a secret or a conspiracy theory or some well-guarded sinister plan. It's right there in the Corpo manual. They aren't hiding it. Page 1. Make as much money as possible. It doesn't matter how. It's literally illegal for them to do or prioritize anything else. And ultimately, that's the real reason the storytelling in this game is a mess. It couldn't be anything else. Now, it didn't have to be this fucking stupid, that's for sure, but there definitely was no room for a competent, well-paced and told FF7 narrative of any type within the structure that Square Enix forced on this. And it can't help but constantly remind you of that because, well, you already know how it's supposed to go. And when it clearly doesn't go that way, you fucking notice. Now, maybe you notice and you don't care and like it anyway. That's fine, perfectly valid, but you still notice. Every time a potential stroke of brilliance begins to emerge or you appear to be teetering on the edge of genuine immersion, the original sin of trying to split this game into 3 parts blunders into the frame and causes everything to fall apart. You can almost call it beat for beat as you play through the game. Oh, we almost had this cool, immersive scene in this absolutely packed beach resort area, super cool, but instead of allowing the pacing and story of the original to speak for itself, we had to stuff in a bunch of inexplicably mandatory and not at all interesting mini games and embarrassingly out of place robed zombies. So sweet, right? We interrupt your cool mountain trek for some random exposition, apropos of nothing but the Turks in a helicopter about some plot MacGuffins in robes that makes fuck all sense. No, we're not gonna explain them, we just want to call your attention how fucking stupid they are. Want to clear this area? Oops, need a little more power. Oops, need a power cable. Oops, power cable's too short. Now you have to vacuum up Mako. Now it's time to throw boxes at switches for 3 hours. Who thought this was good game design? Remember Mount Coral in the original? Pretty decent little segment, right? Well, now there's a fucking mine in it. And since we heard you like jumping puzzles and mines, we put a jumping puzzle in your mine. In fact, we put a bunch of jumping puzzles in the mine. Actually, it's all jumping puzzles. Hope that's cool. Hope you don't mind all this fun new stuff we've added. See, Daddy Squeenix needed just a few more yachts, and while a single release just wasn't gonna get them for us, but hey, on the bright side, now we have 4. Rebirth is just never as good as it keeps promising you that it is, or that you'd think it was after looking at it. And it's the storytelling that's largely responsible. Despite its genuinely great moments, of which there are definitely a few, certainly more than I expected, the overall impression Rebirth leaves you with is that of a series of cascading disappointments. Now, unlike part 1, it's never truly awful, but it's also never truly great either. It's kind of hard to put into words, but it feels like you're playing an advertisement for Final Fantasy VII instead of an actual game. Like it's just the parts that they made for the ad footage, but there's not any actual real gameplay or sensible narrative underneath. Nothing connects the way it seems like Square was trying to get them to. Characters randomly appear, sometimes literally out of thin air, to offer inane bits of exposition and then vanish, often leaving you wondering why they were even there, because their dialogue was so unnecessary. For God's sake, explain something, please. How many flashback scenes do I have to sit through where Cloud freaks out, Tifa says, "Are you okay?" and Cloud goes, "Yeah," before you start telling me what the fuck is happening? Don't make me wait until chapter 10 for the story to become even partially legible. Pretty sure I knew the point of the original story earlier than 30 hours in. Not much left of that though. In fact, they ruined the original story so much that they had to invent robed zombie guys in an entire alternate timeline just to move the game through the original locations because the plot they had left no longer worked to do that. At one point, and I quote directly from the game, you're literally driving around in circles looking for a black robe.
Driving in circles, hoping to spot a black robe is the worst idea ever!
How can anyone defend that? It was flying trash bags in part 1, now they've added robed Sephiroth zombies. Like, y'all didn't need to do this to simply justify making the game different than the original. I'm sorry, but the Tetsuya Nomura robed zombies on a beach humor / style doesn't really work well when the tone keeps getting yanked back and forth between that and attempted super emotional moments like Barrett screaming as he guns down his childhood friend, or forcing toddler Aerith to wander around sobbing while saying, "I'm sorry, mommy." What the fuck?
I'm sorry, Mommy. I tried.
That's deranged. It's deranged and it doesn't fit, and it feels like they're trying to do Kingdom Hearts more than they're trying to do Final Fantasy VII. I didn't want a Kingdom Hearts game, guys. You're trying too hard out here. No one needed Final Fantasy fucking Quantumania. It's so much partially realized extraneous nonsense for nonsense's sake. And it would be one thing if this was all somehow superior or better than the original, but it's not. At all. It's way worse. Like, a lot. Or you know what? Maybe Square and Nomura are right. You know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm the biggest idiot on the planet. I mean, it's probably for the best, right? I mean, who really liked the original story anyway? Following around these zombies with the cool robes, that's way more fun, right? Like, that's what the original was missing, now that I think about it. I hope they remake the whole Final Fantasy series and replace the plot in each one with zombies in robes and flying garbage bags. Now that is the only real way to tell a story. And don't even get me started on the ending. I'm not gonna go into it. Suffice it to say that they went to all the effort to make different timelines and shit, and spoiler alert, and Aerith still dies. What a bunch of pussies. I wanted Cloud to pull a Chrono and get himself killed. That would have been fucking sick. Just letting Aerith live this time, that would have been some pussy shit. Just switching the girl who gets killed to Tifa, that would have been lame too. If you guys were really gonna go all the way, you should have killed Cloud. Now that would have impressed me. But no, we got Kingdom Hearts Quantumania instead. She's dead, but like not really, but also kinda.
Y'all smoking crack!
Now, before everyone starts throwing themselves out the window and taking baths with the toaster, all is not lost. Let's talk about some of the good stuff, because yes, as I was quite shocked to find out, there is good stuff. Quite a bit, actually. Kinda gotta hand it to Square Enix in some ways. They really tried to make up for part 1. Well, in some aspects anyway. In fact, it sort of reminded me of the Blizzard approach. You take a bunch of popular stuff from other well-received games, then try to do them better and stuff it all in there. Yeah, Rebirth is absolutely packed with stuff to do. You got minigames, chocobo racing, combat sims, world quests, there's even Ubisoft open world towers here. Sweet. Now, whether you want to do any of this stuff, though, that's a completely separate matter. Since I personally did not, the game needed to rely on more, conventional features to impress me. And to the extent that it's possible, they kinda did. I think probably the one that succeeded the most for me was the sheer scale of the locations and towns here. This is a rare RPG where I actually felt like I was in a major city or town whenever I entered a local population center. Hardly since Final Fantasy XII, maybe 14 if you count that, has this been accomplished so well, and regardless of the packaging, it was awesome and made visiting settlements super enjoyable. You truly feel as though these were populated places with actual things to do and characters to interact with. Imagine that. Somehow between Final Fantasy XVI and this, Square Enix decided to remember how to make cities and towns again. That's convenient. There's even a few genuine wow moments when my entrenched cynicism was overcome by just how cool some of this stuff looked. The first time you approach Junon, it's crazy. When you first get to the overlook on Mount Coral, you see the Ruin Reactor, Cosmo Canyon, the Temple of the Ancients. Even I won't try to tell you that stuff's not totally awesome. It is, and the Gold Saucer especially looks absolutely fucking insane. It's crazy. I love the ghost area and the little Tonberry robot from the Haunted Hotel. Super rad. The buggy is even great too. It handles a lot like a warthog from the original Halo. I love the way the absurd physics allow you to just sort of fly around and bounce off everything. Super awesome. Similarly, the just graphics quality and musical score overall it's absolutely fantastic. I have a lot of problems with this game, but the way it looks and sounds, definitely not among them. Except for that track that plays as you're climbing Mount Coral. It's god awful. Otherwise, it's good though. Is it Mount Coral or Corel? Now I feel like I'm pronouncing it wrong. No, I'm bugging out. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Even your silly little band of freaks is not altogether without their own small sense of charm, even if it still barely makes sense why they're all hanging out together anyway. Now don't get it twisted, for the most part the majority of the writing is janky, puerile, and cringy, with the interplay between Cloud and Tifa being perhaps the worst offender. It's so stilted and just not at all believable. Cloud seems worse somehow than he was in part 1, though I'm not sure which I prefer more, the obstinate dickhead from the first game or the perpetually mildly concerned look he's rocking now. Both are equally annoying. That aside though, there are some times, usually when it's at its most self-aware, that the dialogue can border on clever. I like when Barrett remarks, well, we are pretty cool, or pretty much whenever he interacts with Kate Sith or Ketchi, whatever. It's subtle, it's self-aware, it's tongue-in-cheek, and it's pretty good. While it and its like pop up far too infrequently to make any sort of real lasting impact on how the dialogue and writing presents overall, it's still a nice reminder that humans must have been involved in at least some parts of Rebirth's development. But then it was time for minigames. Minigames, right guys? Love them or leave them, seems like we just gotta have them to some extent in almost everything these days. Gotta pad out that content after all. All I ask though, when it comes to this nonsense, is that I am able to easily avoid it. Different people like different shit, my taste might not be popular, I get it, it's fine. Just let me avoid the dumb shit, please. But instead of doing that, Rebirth commits one of the cardinal minigame sins very early on, and that's taking a minigame / side activity originally introduced as optional and then flipping it to mandatory with no warning. Imagine if Final Fantasy VIII suddenly brought the plot to a screeching halt until you learned how to play and won a bunch of games of Triple Triad. Now, it's not impossible or even difficult really, but a gigantic design faux pas in my opinion. If I'm going to need to know how to play Queen's Blood, then tell me that when it's first introduced so I know to pay the fuck attention to the tutorial. That's an appropriate time to let the player know, hey, this is mandatory, maybe you should figure it out. An inappropriate time, for example, is say 20 hours into the game when you're suddenly forced to win 3 rounds of it, because if you don't, well, you can't put on the special bathing suit that for some godforsaken reason is required to progress the game. Yeah, whether it's playing with the ridiculous zoom feature, trying to photograph the correct cactar, parking segways, or being forced to play a card game that learning the rules of wasn't made mandatory prior, the minigames are insufferable and inexplicably forced into just far too many situations. Man, I just want to play through the story. I don't want to play bootleg Rocket League. I don't want to fuck around with the goddamn camera, and I have zero interest in shooting at balloons on a pirate ship or playing Beat Mania. I am likewise uninterested in card games or solving truth or lie riddles or playing around with bad versions of existing games in the gold saucer, or worst of all, having to look up the solutions to all the aforementioned nonsense on fucking IGN. Because geez, the amount of padding it's just inexcusable. Why so much? The first part definitely needed it, but this doesn't, like, at all. The only thing I can be sure of is that it's a complete misery and only serves to obliterate whatever pacing still remains in this clusterfuck. Costa del Sol, like so many other locations in this game, would have all been amazing, immersive, truly impressive areas, were I allowed to experience them at my own pace, in my own preferred way, in my own time. But I wasn't. I was forced into participating in a bunch of insufferable nonsense that was so tedious and obnoxious it almost stopped me from finishing the fucking game numerous times. And now my memory of so many sections of the game isn't how cool they looked or how impressive they were, it's just of how they almost made me turn it off. Shockingly, the gold saucer itself is not nearly as bad as dealing with Costa del Sol, but it's a slogfest in its own way. And I'm sorry, but I don't understand the point of any of this. If it was optional, fine, but I can't help but be annoyed when any game pulls this kind of shit. I feel like I'm being deliberately prevented from proceeding and playing the game how I want to. The game even seems aware that it's making me do stuff I wouldn't do given the choice. And any game that seems aware of something like that, yet continues to do it, just serves to affirm my original conclusion. This is a game that was made to make money, not to be fun. At one point, while you're being forced through yet another ridiculous series of annoying maps that were nothing more than a side quest in the original, Barrett actually remarks, "Why does everything always have to be a pain in the ass?" Yeah, gee, why? Why does everything have to be a pain in the ass? The chocobo racing, when I finally got to it though, well, that was pretty fun. I'll give them that. Next up is combat, which, to their credit, is definitely better than in part 1. Slightly improved. A little more than slightly improved, maybe. But it still suffers from many of the same issues as part 1. Topping my list of shit about it that pissed me off is the enemy AI, just like in part 1. It can mostly be simplified down to focus fire the player character or Cloud. This leads to combat, which, in addition to being predictable, consists largely of just using other characters to spam heals on Cloud, frequently going through several battles in a row where literally no one other than Cloud needs healing at all. As a result, most battles feel like they're just this one-dimensional button mash fistfuck. To its credit, the button mashing does feel rather nice. Tight controls, great movesets for all the characters, with some truly cool synergy moves, spells, specials, limit breaks, and summons. They look really awesome. The problem is just that you never really need any of it. Like part 1 before it, Rebirth almost constantly overestimates its own depth and the need for complex systems to address it. For example, the weapon leveling system, the folio system, even the crafting. They're all cool and fun to play with, no doubt. But your interest in them is savagely curtailed the moment you notice, well, you don't really need to engage with any of them to comfortably beat the game. The straight stat boosters on the only really relevant feeling perks here, the stuff that just gives you flat plus 200 HP or 3% basic attack damage increase. And even those, they don't really feel necessary to engage with, though in their defense, unlike most of the other character development systems, you do actually notice them. Rebirth just feels like the entirety of it was balanced around stock Cloud with a baseline Buster Sword and Giga Potions. If this was a pure action game or your basic third-person brawler, whatever, that's fine. But it's not, it's a role-playing game, and though I feel like we just had to go over this point with Square Enix back in Final Fantasy XVI, we'll do it again here. Your character progression, guys, needs to feel like it has a satisfying and transformative effect on your moment-to-moment gameplay. Otherwise what? Yes, there's no motivation for the player to engage with it beyond base curiosity or boredom. And I don't think I need to point out that that probably is not great game design. And speaking of subpar game design, there's still no jump button. There is, however, for no reason I can fathom, a terrain action button in its place, which is really just an interact with the ledge button. How this is superior to the tried and true jump button we'll never know, and I wish I didn't have to ask. Overall though, in all seriousness, despite coming off as kind of an over-engineered mess, the combat does feel good, and for what it is, a third-person action RPG battle system, it's pretty great. Since I will always personally prefer a turn-based approach, I of course hate it, but since we are the fair show in America, I have to be fair, I will say, the combat system is pretty great, especially if you're partial to this style of battle system. I feel like there's a fundamental point that I need to reiterate here, and that is that you cannot make the mistake of thinking that the priority of the Corpos over at Square Enix when developing this was to make something fun or good. It's a rookie mistake, kid. We call that pulling an IGN. I'm sorry to inform you that Square Enix and companies like them are not actually just big, altruistic Santa's workshops from an 80s movie filled with a merry band of joyous little game-making elves that care nothing for petty concerns like earnings reports and are motivated purely by a love of making fun games. Thinking that is like believing that the people behind anti-smoking campaigns just want everybody to be healthier and live longer, happier lives. No, listen, they're just super nice guys, right? The corpos behind those ads care as much about if you die from lung cancer as the corpos behind FF7 Remake care what you think about it after they've got your money. The truth is, anti-smoking campaigns and video games both exist for the same fucking reason. They make people money. A fuckload, as it turns out. In fact, most of the companies behind anti-tobacco sentiments are getting paid millions from tobacco companies like Philip Morris themselves. Why? Not to turn you off from smoking, but to turn you on to smoking different products. These are naturally marketed differently, but usually owned by the same umbrella corps that own the cigarettes you used to smoke before you switched to the much healthier vape pen. Ever wonder who paid for the advertising that got you to switch? Well, now you know. That's what happens in every industry known to man, and I promise you, video games are no different. Don't think for 1 second that the gaming industry is somehow special and immune from the profit motive. That's why this rather unhinged rant is part of the closing remarks. Because when you get right down to it, that is what ruined the Final Fantasy VII Remake and what's ultimately responsible for the state we find it in. The profit motive. Or in other words, the deliberate, calculated intent to sacrifice the delicate balance of gameplay, story, narrative, and characters from the original on the altar of get as much money as fucking possible. Do you truly think that the integrity of the game, world, and experience known as Final Fantasy VII presented even the slightest barrier to Square Enix when they were planning on how they could use it to crank up the profit percentages? Fuck no. Imagine it like this. If the soul of the Final Fantasy VII franchise were a kid crossing the street to buy a comic book and Square was an approaching car, they would blast right through that motherfucker without even slowing down like he was a protester in Florida. No hesitation, they wouldn't even consider it. And that's how you'll feel after this game is done with you. Like you were hit by a car while trying to do something fun. Okay, fine. Enough high school anarchist ranting. Let's get to the scores. Ultimately, I rate a game on how easily I got through it. If I blazed right through a game without even taking a moment to pause, to look at a fact, check out reviews, just flew through it having so much fun I didn't even stop to think about it, that, my G's, is a fantastic fucking game. Anything else I might think about it aside, no matter the critiques or severity of the criticisms I might have for it, the fact remains that if I just blasted through a game, I must have been having a fuck ton of fun. Great example of this for me recently was the original Deus Ex, which, believe it or not, I played for the first time only a few years ago. I busted that motherfucker down so fast I didn't even know it was happening. I was waking up in the morning already thinking about how excited I was to get back to playing it. Made me feel like a fucking kid. Only a rare gem is gonna give you that kind of 10 out of 10 effortless fun and experience. On the contrary, the more I struggle, procrastinate, or generally meander through a game, the less fun I am obviously having, and regardless of how technically competent or well done I may think a game is or how pretty it looks, in the end, if I'm having a hard time getting through it, that speaks for itself, and frankly it speaks louder than any logical breakdown of what I think is occurring might. Geez, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, as might be evidenced by how long it took me to get this review out, is a game that I don't mind saying I struggled with. And not because it was difficult. Well, I mean, difficult in some ways, maybe. I would put it down for often days at a time before eventually forcing myself to pick it back up because I felt so obligated to finish it. It was a grind, guys, and not in a fun way. It didn't even really start moving until like chapter fucking 10 out of 14. And if I didn't feel an obligation to do a video on it, there is no chance I would have finished this game. No shot. And any game I find myself describing like that, that's not a game I can give a high score to. So, overall, on our newly resurrected GamePro rating system here, I'm going to give it a 2.5. It had its moments, and I can see how some people really like it, but in the end, what's there never coalesces into a truly impressive, lived-in, feeling cohesive RPG experience. It's all surface. And because you know Final Fantasy VII already, you recognize what you're seeing while you're playing it, but otherwise it never comes together as anything more than a disjointed mess. It starts off making no sense, and it ends making even less. I'm sorry, geez, but I'm never gonna sign off on a game that almost relies entirely on timey-wimey alternate dimension bullshit. It was dumb when Marvel did it, and it's dumb here. I'd argue it hasn't been cool since Sliders in like 1995. I'd be interested in what people who've never played FF7 think about it though. I, however, have, so I can never see this remake as anything more than one of those YouTube videos where fans redo sections of their favorite old games in Unreal Engine. It certainly looks cool, but there isn't any depth to it. If the story was better told or more interesting or made sense, really, then maybe I'd have more tolerance for the poorly designed and unfocused feel of the rest of the systems and gameplay mechanics in it. But as it stands, when the story fails, the narrative doesn't hold your attention, and the gameplay is little more than rote button mashing combined with systems you don't need, what's left to enjoy? Well, unlike other reviewers, I will play devil's advocate and argue against myself and actually answer that question for those who might really want to enjoy this. If you don't care about the story, plan to skip all the cutscenes, and just want a pretty looking JRPG world to hack and slash your way through with a bunch of tasks and stuff to check off, I can honestly say that you will find what you're looking for here. If that's all you want out of this, you will likely enjoy it quite a bit. There's tons of systems to play with, a huge world full of stuff to do, and a fairly decent combat system with which to do it. If that is all you want, you will find lots to love here, no doubt. However, if you're a fan of Final Fantasy VII and you're looking forward to a faithful recreation of the story and characters you love, you'll find something that looks like that here, but not much else. And as Square Enix should definitely know by now, especially after Final Fantasy XVI, simply looking cool isn't going to be enough to make a good Final Fantasy game. Fortunately for them, and unfortunately for us, that doesn't matter anymore, because in order to make money off the Final Fantasy franchise, you don't actually need a good game anymore, just a well-marketed one. Womp womp. As part of this ridiculous trilogy, though, I will give it a 3.5 out of 5 because compared to Part 1, Rebirth is pretty fucking great. And lastly, on the Final Fantasy scale, it gets a 4 out of 5 because the Final Fantasy scale is almost entirely about aesthetics at this point, and if nothing else, Rebirth certainly nails those. Alright, holy shit, that is our show. We got through it. Thanks so much for chilling with us tonight, spending this little bit of your free time with us. We love you today. We love you all the way. Are you all glad this is over? Because I am very glad that it's over. I hope everybody enjoyed, especially the people whom I know were looking forward to this. I really made an effort to be as honest and fair as possible while still providing some catharsis to the people who were just as crushed by Square Enix's treatment of Final Fantasy VII as I was. I do apologize for how long it took me to get this out, but as I said, I really was not having that much fun, and since doing this isn't my fucking job, it ended up taking a little while. You can expect my review of the next Doom game, however, on launch day.
Woke up, smoke up, blunt, then I pass out. Pass out. Woke up, what up, smoke up, blunt, then I'm back down. Back down. What? Yup, woke up, smoke up, blunt, then I pass out.